Okay, I think we should get started, and Kessler will just keep letting folks in. So I'd like to um, begin by welcoming you and also just introducing you to Kessler Douglas, our graduate research assistant, who is here to help admit people if you fall off the call, if you need to be let back in, if you're having any technical issues. Not that we can fix everything on our end, but if there's information you need to let us know, you can type in the chat to everyone or the co-hosts, and you can let Kessler know if you're having any issues so that he can let me know. My name is Ellen Waterman. I'm the director of the Research Center for Music, Sound, and Society in Canada at Carleton University in Ottawa. I welcome you to this space and time where we can exchange ideas about music, sound, and environment. And I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today. We have registrants from 3 continents, and I especially thank folks from Australia who are joining us late at night. This study day is funded by a knowledge mobilization grant from Carleton University and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The symposium included a live concert of Schafer's chamber music last week, and it will lead to a book project on contemporary approaches to music, sound, and environment. I'm very grateful to all the presenters who are sharing their work with us today. We're gathering here from many places and contexts with different obligations. I'm a white, cisgender, reasonably abled settler Canadian with a secure job. I meet with you today and offer this land acknowledgement from my position of privilege and responsibility. I grew up in a climate of racism on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and Dakota peoples in Treaty 1 territory in Manitoba. I currently live and work in Ottawa, Canada, as a guest on unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. We are meeting on a platform, Zoom, on a network, the internet, that assumes that we have the privilege and agency to access it. Recognizing our privilege and committing to work for a more equitable society is a responsibility and an ever-renewing commitment. Today is a stark reminder of that responsibility. September 30th is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. It recognizes the dark legacy of 150 years of Indian residential schools and of the resulting intergenerational trauma. We honor the survivors and mourn the deaths of children who never returned home. We work towards doing a better job to complete the 94 actions recommended by the TRC report in 2015, only 11 of which have yet been completed. I want to acknowledge from the outset of this study day that some of the words and actions of Armory Schafer were harmful and are still capable of causing pain to Indigenous people. Early in his career, Schafer was committed to the idea of the composer as an international artist, not bound by nationalist sentiments. He was the product of his time, a time in Canada when, nearing the centennial anniversary of this very young country, there was both an atmosphere of combined nationalist optimism and deep anxiety about Canadian identity. He argued that as a former British colony, there was no such thing as authentic Canadian culture as yet. And in 1961, he wrote that a Canadian music could not be founded on Indigenous culture, in part because it was unmusical. Arguably, a quarter of a century later, in 1984, he over-identified Canadian identity with Indigenous culture in a way that, as Dylan Robinson has argued, illustrated Schafer's cultural anxiety that played out as, quote, a trope of Native family inheritance and a celebration of cultural amnesia. This later stance of Schafer's also acknowledges the harm wrought by colonizers. Whitey's discovery of America is a lie, he says. Schafer freely borrowed from global cultures past and present, including Indigenous cultures. In some of his work, Schafer mimicked Indigenous stories, borrowed from Indigenous languages, used Indigenous symbols, and in at least one documented case, he appropriated a Blackfoot chant without attribution. In this, he was not alone among 20th century Canadian composers who were actively encouraged to identify with Indigenous music and to plunder, salvage ethnography archives in order to develop a distinctly Canadian sound. Later today, Jeremy Strawn will tell us about the Indigenous-led Accountability for Change Council, a reparative initiative at the Canadian Music Centre that is initiating tough conversations about how we are to approach this history of national identification through cultural appropriation. So before we begin this study day, I want to acknowledge the artistic climate of Indigenous resurgence in Canada. It's been called the Indigenous Renaissance. This slide contains the names of just a few of the influential creative Indigenous music and sound artists working in Canada today, and I'm going to read their names. Barbara Asiganak, Andrew Balfour, Leanne Betasamosaki Simpson, Ian Cousin, Chris Dirksen, Jeremy Dutcher, Geronimo Inutik, Marion Newman, Melody McIver, Corey Payette, Dylan Robinson, Olivia Short, Tanya Tagak, Christine Tutu, Lakuluk Williamson Bathory, and Jason Young. The music of these folks is remarkable, and I encourage you to check it out. The purpose of this study day is neither to praise, to condemn, nor to apologize. Murray Schafer was, like all of us, a complicated and flawed human being. He was also an audacious creator and thinker whose ideas have been influential in many parts of the world. Our task today is to ask, how should we reckon with Schafer's ideas in the 21st century? When I first encountered Schafer as an undergraduate music student in 1981, I was outraged by his stance on immigration. He thought Canada was already too full of people, and enchanted by his music. For 10 years early in his career, I had the good fortune to perform in several of Schafer's Patria series of environmental music dramas, and this shaped me as a musician. I wrote my doctoral thesis on the epilogue to the Patria series and Wolf Shall Inherit the Moon, in which I was also a participant. Schafer composed 2 flute pieces for me, and he was a generous mentor to me and to many, many young musicians. Throughout my career, I have drawn on Schafer's heuristic approach to music education. My first book was an edited collection of essays that came out of a meeting of the World Forum for Acoustic Ecology that I organized in 2000 at Schafer's request. Some of the participants in that conference are here today. I've written in praise of Schafer's ideas about interdisciplinary art, which he called the theater of confluence, and I've written critically about his stance on Canadian culture. Then I moved on. For about 20 years, I didn't really think about Schafer. In 2019, I took up a research chair on music in Canada here at Carleton University. For some reason, I was moved to revisit Murray's work. I reread his books, took in new scholarship, and dug in the archives at York University in Toronto for information about Patria 3, The Greatest Show, an environmental music drama in the form of an early 20th century carnival that I had performed in during the late 1980s. This next point is no doubt kind of obvious to many Schafer scholars, but I had not quite realized before how braided together his ideas about environmental music composition, music education, and acoustic ecology are. Because although Schafer is best known for his role in defining the soundscape and developing the field of acoustic ecology, his initial thinking about sound and environment developed alongside his work in experimental music pedagogy and environmental performance during the 1960s and 70s. 1965 was a watershed year for Schafer. He published the first fruits of his experiments in creative music education, The Composer in the Classroom, began a tenure-stream position with the Centre for Communications and the Arts at the new Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, British Columbia, and completed his first multimedia music drama, Loving, composed between 63 and 65 and produced by CBC Television the following year. All three strands of Schafer's work have been examined separately, both in Schafer's own writing and by other scholars. But I want to argue that they are, in fact, co-constitutive, and taken together they outline a relational ontology and a decidedly ecological approach to music in Canada. Schafer's pedagogical ideas were first developed in the context of the John Adaskin Project, Canadian Music for Schools, whose inaugural seminar was sponsored by the Canada Council and organized by the Canadian Music Centre in 1963. He participated along with 14 other Canadian composers who spent time observing and interacting with various school music classes with the aim of determining how to write appropriate repertoire for inclusion in school curricula. Another important venue was the North York Summer Music School, at which Schafer taught musicianship in 1964 and 65. Instead of teaching musical materials to students, Schafer engaged them in sonic experiments through which they could explore and discover the basic principles of music for themselves. It was the start of a lifelong engagement with heuristic music pedagogy that saw Schafer's experimental approach to music education taken up by students of all ages and educators internationally. His work is chronicled in several pamphlets published between 65 and 75 and collected in the book The Thinking Ear in 1986. Schafer began conceptualizing his Patria series of environmental music dramas in 1965, initially as a trilogy of works on themes of alienation and belonging. Patria is Latin for homeland. Schafer states, "My idea was that two principal characters, a man and a woman, would engage in a search for one another through a labyrinth of different cultures, almost as if they were split halves of the same being. They might return in various guises, but the quest for unity and the homeland they were seeking would remain elusive until their final encounter. Patria then is not a country, but a state of mind, a quest for identity and security, a place to breathe and be inspired, not expired." Over the next 4 decades, the cycle evolved into 12 works, only 2 of which are meant to be performed in traditional theaters. In addition to the carnival setting of Patria 3, The Greatest Show, the works are set in unusual environments, including a wilderness lake, a garden to be ritually planted in spring and harvested in autumn, a procession through a series of urban venues from dusk till dawn, and a built labyrinth meant to be threaded by a single audience member at a time. This last, designed by Gerard Smith, took 10 years to construct and is located on Schafer's farm. Perhaps the most unusual setting, however, is Patria the Epilogue and Wolf Shall Inherit the Moon, which has been continually developed and performed by an intergenerational collaboration between professional and community artists in a woodland setting for a week each August every year since 1989. I had the opportunity to revisit that project this summer in a very moving iteration of it that included the scattering of Murray's ashes on the site. The work, which has no outside audience, comprises music, dance, theater, storytelling, canoeing, and camping in a daily sequence of rituals. With typical irony, Schafer insists that Canada's indifference to homegrown talent protected him from writing conventional operas. Indeed, although music is definitely the through line of all 12 works in the cycle, Schafer desired to create a form of music theater that would put the arts into counterpoint with one another such that each retained its distinct identity, a strategy he termed the theater of confluence. And this brings me to the third strand of Schafer's work. In 1965, Schafer found himself teaching in an experimental communications program at Simon Fraser University, very much influenced by the communication theorist Marshall McLuhan. In his 2012 memoir, Schafer cites the extreme noisiness of construction at the university and in burgeoning Vancouver as the impetus for turning his attention to the study of the soundscape. Along with a team of student research assistants, Schafer set out to observe, measure, analyze the context of, and catalog sounds in their environment. His objectives included noise abatement, improved sonic design, and the preservation of historical, treasured, and endangered sounds. The World Soundscape Project's empirical research resulted in publications such as The Book of Noise, The Vancouver Soundscape, 5 Village Soundscapes and European Sound Diary, and a set of 10 radio programs on the Vancouver Soundscape that aired on the CBC radio program Ideas in 1974. It also gave rise to Schafer's most famous book, The Tuning of the World, published in 1977 and reissued in 1993 as The Soundscape, which sets out a Euro-American history of the soundscape, sourced through evidence in literature and painting, a lexicon of key terms, and an empirical methodology for the nascent field. The WSP outlived Schafer's involvement in it, largely through the work of 2 of its former student researchers, Barry Truax and Hildegard Westerkamp. The WSP's influence was truly international, and in 1993, the World Forum for Acoustic Ecology was created, with separate branches in Australia, Japan, the United States, Canada, the UK, and several European countries. So that's some background on these 3 big strands of Schafer's work. For today's conversations, I've invited people from all 3 of these strands: music education, acoustic ecology, and environmental music. Several of our presenters knew and worked closely with Schafer. Others have written across the grain of Schafer's work, providing important critiques. I also invited some presenters on the basis of their creative innovations in music, sound, and environment. These folks may not reference Schafer's work at all, but they have innovative perspectives on the core ideas we're talking about today. Ultimately, we are concerned with ways of articulating and understanding the relationships among music, sound, and environment in our current world, a world marked by climate crisis and enormous social transformations. Thank you for your interest and for your active listening today. I hope you enjoy the day, and I look forward to our conversations. A few protocols. Due to the large number of participants on the call, I've muted your microphones and turned off your cameras. This will save bandwidth and help protect us in case we get a rogue Zoom bomber. I've asked the presenters to give short 10-minute presentations, really provocations to spark discussion. For each session, I will introduce all the presenters. They will each speak, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. So please type your comments and questions in the chat. You can chat to everyone or to the co-host. We've disabled chatting to an individual on the call. So we'll monitor the chat and we'll relay your questions and comments to the presenters. And if we feel like there's a moment where it's important to for you to speak to your comment, I'll unmute you so you can do that. And I apologize again for the kind of uber control of that. Okay, here we go. I'm going to stop my share. And I'm going to introduce our first 3 presenters. Leah Barclay is the head of design for the School of Business and Creative Industries at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Australia. She's also the vice president of the World Forum for Acoustic Ecology. Our second presenter is Helmi Järviluoma, who is Professor Emerita in Cultural Studies of the University of Eastern Finland and the director of the Sensory Transformations Project. And our third presenter is John Drever, Professor of Acoustic Ecology and Sound Art at Goldsmiths University of London in the UK, and director of the Aural Diversity Project. So welcome, John, Helmi, and Leah. Please unmute and just say hi. I think we need a moment of human contact here.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
Hi, everyone.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and spotlight Leah so that you can then share and go ahead with your presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you for the invitation to be part of this event, Ellen. What a inspiring program and an inspiring collection of people you've brought together. So I'm going to screen share. And you should be able to see my slides now. So I'm going to talk quite broadly about some of the current acoustic ecology research that I'm engaged with in Australia. But I would firstly like to start by acknowledging the fact that I'm talking to you today from the unceded lands of the Gubbi Gubbi people on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia. And I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Indigenous people joining us on this session today. The image we're looking at is the Maroochy River on Gubbi Gubbi country, just down the road from where I am now. And this is an incredible river system where I've been very privileged to work and collaborate with Lyndon Davis, who's a Gubbi Gubbi musician, who I've been very privileged to work with for over 15 years now. And much of the acoustic ecology research that I'll discuss today is also being conducted in collaboration with Lyndon. So I wanted to acknowledge his work as well. So most of the research that I'm heavily involved in is fundamentally about listening to the environment, listening to the changes that are happening in ecosystems across our planet. And this idea of, listening as a way to truly understand communities and understand these changes that are happening in different parts of our planet. So I've been, really privileged to work in this field of acoustic ecology and really work at this intersection of art and science, looking at the way that environmental field recordings can be a tool to understand environmental health, but the way that environmental field recordings can also really connect us to places and communities and, help us understand what's happening in our ecosystems. And I've used this slide, in a few presentations, sometimes slightly adapted versions of this. And this is a particularly chaotic version of it, but I guess I wanted to use it in the context of this provocation today, because I really think of acoustic ecology as this inherently interdisciplinary field, this umbrella that connects so many of the interdisciplinary ways that we're thinking about sound and environmental music and these emerging fields of ecoacoustics and soundscape ecology. I really see acoustic ecology as the umbrella that is exploring the social, cultural and ecological context of our environment through sound. And I think it's quite interesting, when we reflect on some of those foundational moments in acoustic ecology, that very first WFAE conference, the field has always been inherently interdisciplinary. That first conference was bringing together artists and scientists and Indigenous knowledge systems as well. So I'm really passionate about the true interdisciplinary possibilities of acoustic ecology as a way to connect communities around these different perspectives on sound. And so for me, with a background in, composition and sound art, I guess, fundamentally the interdisciplinary work I'm engaged in is, very much about presenting this work in creative contexts as well. So creating immersive performances and installations, creating locative media projects that allow us to connect with soundscapes that we might not traditionally have access to, and creating site-specific performances and installations like this project, for example, Listening Underwater, which was a geodesic dome on Mooloolaba Beach on the Sunshine Coast here that was connecting with live streams and environmental field recordings from different aquatic ecosystems across southeast Queensland and allowing the local community to be immersed underwater. And so all of these creative projects are kind of connected into a lot of research I've been engaged with around sort of the scientific possibilities of acoustic ecology as well. The way that we can develop these interdisciplinary community embedded projects that can allow us to map environmental changes through sound. And I think we've seen, you know, such a exciting and rapid development in this field in the last 5 years in particular, where we now have devices like the Audio Moth, which, you know, run on an SD card and 3 AA batteries and are very affordable and can be installed in remote locations, recording the soundscapes of changing environments over long durations. So a device like this, I think, is quite transformational for the kind of interdisciplinary possibilities of acoustic ecology, when it means, you know, remote communities that may not have been traditionally able to access this kind of technology can now be, you know, running citizen science projects on the ground and really mapping environmental changes through sound. So the kind of projects that I'm engaged with are really looking at those interdisciplinary possibilities of embedding acoustic ecology at all different levels within community engagement models. An example of that is Biosphere Soundscapes, which actually turns 10 this year. You know, this is a project that's been running for the last decade, mapping the changing soundscapes of UNESCO biosphere reserves and really working in a responsive and adaptable way in different biosphere reserves across the planet. We now have 3 biosphere reserves here in southeast Queensland that are all right on the boundary of each other, and that are really looking at kind of reimagining the way that we can work with sound in the environment, and that it can be truly interdisciplinary. And one of the things we've really been driving is looking at the potential of live streaming audio as a way for us to connect with these global biosphere reserves. And this has been done in collaboration with an organisation in the UK called SoundCamp. Another example of this is the River Listing Project, which has been exploring the cultural and biological diversity of global river systems through sound, really looking at hydrophones, underwater microphones, as a way to understand river systems, to measure the health of river systems through sound, and again, truly working at that intersection of art and science. And, you know, this has had a very strong education component as well in engaging young people along the river systems to make hydrophones, to conduct their own environmental field recordings, and to create their own river sound maps and river compositions as a way to connect communities to these river systems. Another example of this is research that I've been heavily involved with in Australia in really looking at the health and well-being benefits of listening to environmental soundscapes, and, you know, how we can really look at the potential of this in various contexts as well, particularly looking at working with remote Indigenous communities, mapping the soundscapes of country, and then bringing those soundscapes to people that may not traditionally have access to them. An example of this is the Listening to Country project, which we've been running for 3 years now. This image here is from the first iteration, working in the Brisbane Women's Prison with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women who participated in this project in a way that we ran workshops in the prison, spoke about the sounds that made them feel connected to country and the locations that they were from, and then we went to those locations, recorded environmental soundscapes, and brought those back to the prison, and the women then composed soundscapes with us, and those soundscapes were then used as a tool for health and well-being in the prison. And this was funded by the Lowitja Institute for Indigenous Health, and, you know, the outcomes from this were quite profound in that there was absolutely no doubt that environmental soundscapes in this confronting context of a prison soundscape had a profound positive impact on you know, the health and well-being of the women that we were working with. And you can see in this image here, we were also mapping the soundscapes of the body and sounds that they were making in the prison with the environmental soundscapes. And finally, I just wanted to reflect on some very recent work in looking at this idea of, you know, remote engagement with these soundscapes. We've been playing with lots of different ways, particularly here on the Sunshine Coast in Australia, of, you know, looking at the interdisciplinary possibilities of streaming sound online and allowing people to engage with that in different ways. So an example of this is the Listening in the Wild project, which has been developed with Lyndon Davis, who I mentioned at the start, Gubby Gubby Songman, and Trisha King, who's a photographer, and really looking at how we can create these remote embodied experiences of natural environments through sound, and bringing these to places where people may not traditionally have access to this. So the first series was created around 3 locations on the Sunshine Coast, on the Maroochy River, where Lyndon basically played didgeridoo into the river system, was telling local stories. So he was leading this whole experience. And we mixed these soundscapes of the river live with the knowledge of the river system, and, you know, hydrophones in the water with the didgeridoo, literally playing into the riverbed, resonating with those environmental soundscapes, and, you know, created this piece that allowed you to connect with the river system in a completely different way, with a body of photography that accompanied it for you to be able to engage with online. We created a similar version of Udlo Creek in Queensland as well, this transient experience through the rainforest and along the creek. And a final part of this trilogy in a marine environment out to Old Woman Island, which is just off the coast of Queensland here. And, you know, this is a time where humpback whales are on their southern migration. So we're surrounded by whale song. In this experience, we had hydrophones in the water. Again, you know, Lyndon telling stories of this experience, mapping this cultural knowledge with environmental soundscapes and these incredible soundscapes of the reef surrounding the island as well. And, you know, created this quite unique moment in time with the migrating whales, which was a very significant moment here on the Sunshine Coast as well. So this was all kind of playing with these different ideas of, you know, how we can sort of push the boundaries of acoustic ecology in real time as a way to connect to these environments, as a way to understand what's happening in these different ecosystems through sound. But, you know, at these particular moments where we haven't been able to travel as much, of course, really looking at the way that, you know, we can share these experiences with wider audiences. And for Lyndon, you know, this has been as a way to share his environmental and cultural knowledge of these local ecosystems as a way to really promote, you know, connection to country and conservation as well. And, you know, for me, these projects are, you know, all experimental. They're all very much based in interdisciplinary research, looking at the artistic and scientific possibilities of sound. But I always ensure that they're embedded in community engagement models, accessible for the community and particularly accessible for young people. So in each of these kind of snapshots of acoustic ecology that I've spoken about, they all have these pathways for young people to really engage with sound and engage with the interdisciplinary possibilities of listening and acoustic ecology. And, you know, I truly feel that if we can create these pathways where young people are able to engage with sound, engage with these exciting interdisciplinary possibilities, you know, there's a lot of hope for the future. I think I'm on about 10 minutes now, so I will stop there. Thank you.
Bravo. Thank you very much, Leah, for getting us started with such an important and exciting presentation. So I'm now going to spotlight you, Helmi Järviluoma, and I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this will work okay, because I'm going to run your slides. So here we go. So everybody should be able to see Helmi's slides and also Helmi.
Can you hear me as well?
Pardon me?
Can you hear me as well?
Yes, I can hear you fine. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay. So welcome, Helmi. Go ahead.
Okay. I just give a little sign when you can change the slide. But
Okay.
So, dear listeners in Canada and elsewhere via the internet, and thank you very much for inviting me to this study day. And please, yeah, Ellen, change the slide. I'm a professor of cultural studies at the University of Eastern Finland. Actually, I've just retired, so I'm an emerita at the moment. And today I'm mostly talking about a project that just ended. It was called Sensory Transformations and Transgenerational Environmental Relationships in Europe between 1950 and 2020. It was called Sensotra. And it has a strong basis in soundscape studies, as you will soon see. So please, Ellen. I am going to mostly talk about one possible methodology for studying the ways in which sounds, music, the moving human being, as well as other senses, all relate in the creation of atmospheres and experiences of places, namely sensobiographic walking. Please, Ellen. As sensobiography becomes a way to understand the converging of the personal into the larger social contexts, the biographical can help us progress towards the transformational processes of the sensory environment and help us to understand how subjects, different generations, groups, and institutions interpret societal transformations. The sensobiographic walking method is in a manner of attending to the situational entanglement of the past and present in sensory experiences. It's a kind of mobile life writing, talking sensory life into being while moving, and then the research writing about the biographical fractions captured by microphone and video devices. Please, Ellen. So I would say that sensobiographic walking is in a way a culmination in a very long row of attempts to chase the ever-escaping phenomena related to sensory remembering together with my colleagues. It has a long history. I will talk a little bit about it soon, but this particular format was developed for this large European Research Council funded project Sensotra. So we were engaging participant pairs composed of different generations in 3 middle-sized European cities, Turku, Brighton, and Ljubljana. And we actually walked all together with 180 walkers. They formed 26 to 32 transgenerational pairs in each city. I'm not going to talk too much about the projects. You can find still its web page, and also the final book is just coming out from Taylor and Francis, so it will be soon there. Music researcher Friedel Riedel has urged us to think in terms of atmospheric relations, directing attention, she says, to the ways in which a rhythm or sound translates itself into the environment, and in doing so modulates a situation in its entirety and pulls all bodies within reach into a relationship. I quite like that definition in the book she wrote in the introduction of the book called Music as Atmosphere. And actually also we, since Sensotra researchers, we have an article in this book. Yes, Ellen, thanks. Here's just a Wikipedia definition of sensobiographic walking as an ethnographic research method, which provides a possibility for the study of rich, embodied, and site-specific emergence of sensory remembering and experiences. Yeah. Well, now coming to the multiple routes of sensobiography. Of course, we all know that the founder of soundscape studies, it's usually said that it's Schafer. as we all know, music educator, researcher, provocateur, composer. In Finland, we could also playfully ask whether it could have been Johan Graner who wrote a book called Poor Geography already in 1930. We always say that Finnish soundscape studies started already in 1930s. And now what is situation in Finland in 2019? Almost daily one bumps into the word soundscape in our media. And not used, the word is not used only by journalists, but also by quite ordinary regional and local media workers. Yeah, the next slide. And when it comes to the how did soundscape studies enter Finland, I've been writing about this in a recent article called Sensobiographic Walking and Ethnographic Approach of the Finnish School of Soundscape Studies in a book called The Bloomsbury Handbook of Popular Music and Plays. And there I'm arguing that in late 1980s in Tampere University, there happened a fruitful crossbreeding of new efficient ethnomusicological field research training, emergent popular music studies, and ethnomethodological sociology. So we already started in 1980s there to work on soundscapes, doing small fieldwork projects. And after the first time that Amare Schafer came to Finland, which was, well, at least for my knowledge, it was in 1992, we had several visits. He made several visits, long ear cleaning courses, presentations in conferences and universities. We actually published jointly the first yearbook of soundscape studies in 1998. And also he was participating in the planning work and support for acoustic environments in change project. Yeah, now we can go forward. I would say that when we talk about sensobiographic walking, I do think that the Canadian-led soundscape studies were very innovative straight from the beginning of the 1970s. After all, they were among the earliest humanities scholars articulating ecology in their discourse already in the mid-70s, promoting not only the diversity of biological ecosystems, but bringing forth acoustic ecology, the idea of importance of maintaining and promoting the many-faceted nature of sonic environments. Also, one only needs to think about the recent keen interest towards the walking methodology and the fact that in the 1970s, the representatives of soundscape studies, this is a reminder that my time is running out. It's horrible, but I will
just carry on, Helmi.
A couple of minutes. Well, yeah, in 1970s already, the representatives of soundscape studies were ahead of their time and with their mobile dynamic methods of studying environment. And in its experimental methodologies when studying the 5 village soundscapes in Europe 1975, World Soundscape Project researchers combined arts and sciences. Just as Leah was talking, this was really inspiring for us as well. But there are some points, even if one of the most interesting methods then was walking, 5 village soundscapes, the method was not yet used in its full potential. Instead, researchers often ended up in quantitative listing of sounds while walking. So what I genuinely think is that as Finnish cultural analysts, we were able to develop more specifically the qualitative methodologies, pushing off from the basis described in the beginning of this chapter. And I just mentioned one more thing. As early as in 1970s, soundscape studies also took seriously a variety of materialities and rhythmicities. Consequently, it is undoubtedly worthwhile to link these developments to this new turn of the after millennium, new millennium, namely new materialism. Sensobiographic and topobiographic ideas can easily be intermixed with the current study of atmospheres. And this is exactly what we have done in the project I was just talking about, namely Sensotra. Here we can see a letter from Barclay Schafer. I just tell you a little bit about it. I just became a professor emerita, so I'm very happy about that. But when emptying my office at the University of Eastern Finland 3 weeks ago, I found dozens of letters from Barclay Schafer, usually beautifully handwritten. It brought to my mind several joint projects, and I first met him via a creative popular music education project, and he came. I still think that Schafer was at his best while he was giving these 2-day courses, which allowed us to delve into the making of drama with the help of mere sounds. But then Murray always remembered to be complaining, I think also a bit rudely, about soundscape researchers, and he said that the soundscape people had not produced proper research, and that would be sorely needed. So that was when I started to draft the first plans of the large European project called Acoustic Environments in Change, and the projects of which then came out as a thick book in 2009 with 4 CDs, and it also included a reprint from the 5 village soundscapes and all the recordings that were really with a big help from Barry Truax. We were able to edit that collection. And also there was a constant help from and support from Barclay Schafer. And here actually, this is the first letter in 1999 that he says that he's really wants to help us in finishing the projects. I maybe if we run just quickly through the rest of the slides.
We're a few minutes over time, Helmi.
Okay, if I can just see if there is something I really want to see. I really think that you already know about Acoustic Environments in Change project, so I don't have to talk about this. We may as well, if you go to the next slide, I can show you that all the sounds from the acoustic environments in Change projects are in SoundCloud. So if you go to SoundCloud and put acoustic environments in Change, you will then hear all those sounds. And I would particularly urge you to listen to the Les Conil Sonic Memory Walk in Quarter de 80. Yeah. So please, you can, yeah. And the next slide, I do think that this is a picture of Sensotra project. Yeah. And the next slide, I think, is just a couple of nice words about the sensobiographic walking. I just read the last sentence, which I wrote together with a couple of Sensotra project members. The sensobiographic walking method entails a shift from thinking about methods as processes of gathering data towards understanding them as entangled in unfolding relationships. So, and let us just see the Sensotra's web page. Oh, actually, it's not a web page, but it's a sensor tour in ThingLink. So if you go to ThingLink, you can listen to stories or sensory experiences in all 3 cities, Turku, Brighton, and Ljubljana. Yeah, you should go to ThingLink and search for sensor tour. Yeah, I think I'm now getting, if you show, yeah, this is the book that is coming out from Taylor and Francis. I hope, oh yeah, not this year, not last year, but this year. It is called Sensory Transformations, Environments, Technologies, Sensor Biographies. And I think I'm going to thank you once more, Ellen, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Helmi, and for this important work, and really great to have that historical perspective as well as this exciting extensions of this work that you've done. So I'm now going to stop my share, the narration we do on Zoom, and invite John Drever to share his screen. And I have spotlit you. And we can see your screen just fine. So we just need your
file.
And while we're just waiting for you to get set up, we'll take questions and discussion. We have quite a bit of time for that after this presentation. And so please be, you can go ahead and start populating the chat with comments and questions for the speakers. And we'll have about half an hour to talk after the next presentation. Go ahead, John.
Okay. Are my slides the right way round?
Yep.
You see my
Yep. Looks right to me. Yep.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, thanks very much. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. So thanks, Ellen, and it's great to talk after Helmi. Her Acoustics, Environment, and Change project was a big inspiration for me. So in this talk, I want to kind of really think about where hearing is in Schafer's work, and what I've kind of learned from that, and how it's informed my work. I should say that in my background, when I read Tuning of the World as an undergrad, probably in my final year in the early 90s, it was a huge inspiration, and I took it all in, hook, line, and sinker, completely. And my background was very much in avant-garde experimental music. And through Tuning of the World, it kind of allowed me to kind of connect to the real world, if I may say that. So it was really helpful. But of course, as one develops and one learns, I kind of see the gaps, as we all know. And so here I was particularly kind of thinking about hearing, and particularly this kind of idea that I've been talking a lot about recently around oral diversity, as a kind of starting point for this. And in this talk, there's lots of kind of little questions, really, and I don't know how much is resolved, because I think, like many of us, we feel ambivalent about some of what Schafer has kind of given to us and that we've inherited. So my first kind of big exploration into acoustic ecology was leading a project called Sounding Dartmoor, which was a soundscape study on Dartmoor, the national park, wonderful place. Spent a couple of years there. Very, very interesting project, and lots of things happened during that time, like the foot and mouth outbreak. But I wanted to tell an anecdote where me and Greg Wagstaff were invited to talk to the local BBC radio station in early morning. I think it was 7:30 in the morning, and we drove down to Plymouth, and I was asked the question, why am I doing this project? Which I got stuck, because I didn't have a kind of nutshell answer to that. And I very quickly started talking a bit like I'd heard Murray Schafer talking before. And I started saying, well, people don't know how to listen, and I know how to listen, and I'm really connected to the soundscape, and I want to teach people about the soundscape and kind of offer them a deeper engagement with the sonic environment and all that kind of stuff. Quickly afterwards, I realized, why did I say that? Do I believe that? And actually, I very much learned during the project that I was wrong. And I actually learned from the people there about the soundscape. They were the experts. They had the nuanced listening, and I didn't teach them anything. They taught me masses, and actually, so it's quite interesting. those kind of journeys we have. So as I said, I want to talk about kind of hearing, and just quickly to present this new term, what I call aural typical hearing, and let's see how aural typical is Murray's thinking, particularly in tuning of the world. So it's kind of an obvious term. Aural typical is kind of borrowed from the idea of neurotypical and neurodiverse. So here I'm saying aural typical people tend to impose their understanding of normal hearing on everyone else as correct and natural. It's not just about people, it's also aural typical hearing is actually ingrained in acoustics and audio engineering. And there's this term otologically normal that acousticians talk about. So I want to kind of move that towards thinking about what about aural diversity? And what is that? So accompanying aural typical hearing, which we are trained to practice as acousticians or musicians or acoustic ecologists, is the actual variety, often less than ideal hearing that we experience throughout our normal day and throughout our lives. I mean our whole lives, from an embryo to an old person with older person with hearing loss, let's say, throughout a normal day and throughout our lives, albeit to varying degrees, from trifling experience of temporary threshold shift, there's buzzes and hisses that we get in our ears and tinnitus, to transient ear noise, to intolerable pain from hyperacusis, which we can call aural diversity. Okay, so we're kind of thinking, well, how typical aural diverse is Schafer's thinking? I can't change my slide. Why can't I change my slide? Oh. Okay, so in Tuning of the World, Schafer does create this quite nice concept of what he calls aural space. This the kind of possible space of hearing that humans have. And he kind of recounts the kind of classic things that we normally read in textbooks about hearing. It's like 20 hertz, well, he says 15, but 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, of course, going back down to touch around 15, and the threshold of pain. And of course, Jonathan Stern has been looking at this quite recently about where this interesting study of the threshold of pain comes from, which is all pretty dubious stuff. But this is a very kind of normative way about thinking about hearing. And it's very, very limited. And not everyone has this kind of hearing. It's a very, as we see a little picture here, goes back to the Fletcher and Munson curves, equal loudness contours in the world of acoustics. In Tuning of the World, he does refer to presbycusis, age-related hearing loss is referenced there. And there is that famous discussion he references about people in Africa have better hearing, being in an industrialized and not industrial world, which is quite controversial. And I don't think that how quantified that has been. But anyway, he's quite normative on the whole, although he does say that there's this is very generally speaking about hearing. What's a bit more troubling is how Schafer talks about deafness. It's deafness is used throughout the Tuning of the World as like a kind of big something we should be really worried about. And it starts right at the beginning of the Tuning of the World, where he says noise pollution is now a world problem. It was seen that the world soundscape has reached an apex of vulgarity in our time. And many experts have predicted universal deafness as the ultimate consequences unless problems can be brought quickly under control. This kind of writing about deafness reminds me a bit like John Howell's writing about blindness. John Howell, amazing guy that many of them have met over the years, who died a few years ago, who became blind later on in life, and wrote about that experience, often about hearing. And he was a professor of theology, and he wrote about the Bible, of how someone who's a Christian reading the Bible as a blind person is very upsetting and disappointing, because it's seen as a very negative thing and being kind of disconnected with God. And Tuning of the World is similar about deafness. And I think certainly, I think many of us kind of feel this kind of, with something like Tuning of the World, it has a kind of strong kind of evangelical feel to it. It's very much about this kind of, this power and quality of hearing, and the soundscape is a very kind of special way of experiencing the world, which is on offer. Counter to that, I've got this kind of quote here from the National Association of the Deaf, thinking about deaf culture, which probably back in the 70s Schafer was not so aware of. It's worth reading the quote here. Many within the medical professionals continue to view deafness essentially as a disability and an abnormality, and believe that deaf and hard of hearing individuals need to be fixed by cochlear implants. This pathological view must be challenged and corrected by greater exposure to an interaction and well-adjusted and successful deaf and hard of hearing individuals. So that really kind of counters that you know, the rise of deaf culture. How does that kind of square with the way of deafness being talked about in Tuning of the World? And of course, Schafer famously talks about this wonderful thing called clairaudience, which is achieved through ear cleaning or ear cleansing exercises. I kind of think, he says it's not mystical, I kind of think it is mystical, where he says, you know, it's a kind of exceptional hearing ability, particularly with regard to environmental sounds. Now, is clairaudience available to all, is kind of my question. Now, the exercises include, most famously, sound walking, which many of us have been engaged with over the years, and I've got a lot out of, and I've enjoyed being in sound walks with Marty Schafer a couple over the years, and I found them very powerful exercise. You know, we walk, we make a plan in advance, and we walk in silence. We don't talk. Mobile phones are turned off. Remember, Marty was very against anyone filming or documenting sound walks, either they're doing it or they're not doing it. But I'll tell you one anecdote from the end of a sound walk where I invite the participants to kind of give some feedback. And a woman told me, actually, she waited till everyone else to talk, and then she gave her feedback, and she said, well, you know, I'm really impressed that you're all getting this very tremendously rich experience of the sound walk, because personally, I found it terrible. You know, as I walked through London, a part of London I know, I did the exercise, you know, I listened, I followed your instruction, John, and I felt the city got louder and louder and louder. And now I can't control the noise of the city from this exercise. And it brings up a kind of ethical question. You know, what do we, if we are ear cleansing, what are we ear cleansing for? If it is a sensitization exercise, are we sensitizing people for a noisy environment? I could talk about this more. My own kind of epiphany with this stuff came out of a study I did about, particularly inspired by my poor kids, was around high-speed hand dryers. And I'm sorry, many of you have heard me speak about this lots of times. It's a project that's dear to my heart and unresolved and unfinished, I think, because we still have lots of very loud hand dryers in public toilets. But my question was, how come we had such a loud device, extremely loud, in such a sensitive space as the public toilet? And here are the names of the brands at the time, which are all kind of militarized. They're all about noise. And I was really, actually, I took a lot from Schafer's ideas about sacred noise and the relationship between power and noise. I'd like to read this quote. There's my kids there, just thinking about the kind of how people have got different hearing. There's my son at the time. He's now 16, but there he is. He was very sensitive to sound, and was very upset by high-speed hand dryers. And there's my daughter smiling, but she enjoyed being terrified, you know, but being terrified, like being in a kind of roller coaster, but being terrified in a public toilet is obviously not a good idea. But let me read this quote, because I think it's quite useful, because it kind of connects to the kind of acoustic ecology idea and how some of my ideas have changed. Excuse me. From the findings and further public response to my study on the noise effects of ultra-rapid ecological hand dryers and publicly accessible toilets, I was propelled to rethink my implicit understanding of sound and hearing. I learned that it perturbs, isolates, excludes, disconnects, disembodies, and dislocates. So these are all negative things, yeah, about sound and hearing. It can precipitate emotions of fear, repulsion, nausea, embarrassment, shame, alienation, bereavement, stage fright, flashback, threat, hallucination, disorientation, insecurity, exposure, vulnerability, dizziness, rage, and sensory shutdown, and can cause severe pain. Okay, and then I talk about particular groups here which are particularly exposed or vulnerable to noise in public spaces. And this is the kind of list here that I kind of started to I learned about people having particular problems with high-speed hand dryers, but it's a microcosm for more bigger soundscape issues, I kind of felt. Andrew Hugo, who I've been working with, and he developed a project called the Oral Diversity Project from these ideas, and he's kind of tidied it up. So this is kind of what we're thinking now around oral diversity. It's interesting to kind of, again, retuning of the world with a kind of oral diverse perspective, which is about, who's hearing, really. And of course, as I said earlier, our hearing does change throughout life. It's not a fixed thing. And of course, the context of our hearing changes from what we are hearing. But as you see, it's very complex, very, very complex. And this is human-based. We don't have even, animal hearing is a little box here, but of course, the more than human world, we have to include it in this kind of soundscape concept, acoustic ecology concept. So those are my main thoughts, really. A little advert. We've got a book on oral diversity coming up. And what I'm kind of proud about in this book is we don't talk about disability and impairment or loss. The book provides many different ways of hearing and different kind of human experience, but it's about difference. And I think that's quite important. Okay, I'm not quite sure how my time's doing, but I'm happy to stop at this stage and answer any questions.
Yeah, brilliantly done. Thank you, John.
How do I turn my slides off?
You stop your share and I will remove the spotlight and to return us to gallery view here. All right, I would invite Helmi and Leah to turn on your cameras as well. And we have a good amount of time for conversation. So what I would like to do is to, as I'm hitting my stride here with this whole lots of people on a Zoom call thing, is to say, yes, type your questions and comments in the chat and we'll monitor that. But also, if you just want to use the reactions button to, put your hand up, then I can unmute you so you can speak. There's me with my thumb up, not my hand up, but you get the idea. Okay. But maybe while people are just thinking their way into it, I'll seed the discussion with a question. It seems to me that all three of your projects, the sensory biographic walking, the much more kind of community engaged acoustic ecology, and this idea of oral diversity, all move acoustic ecology into a super relational realm. I really enjoyed, Helmi, your comment about how we can see acoustic ecology in relation to other contemporary theories, relational theories like new materialism. And so I'm just interested if for the three of you to comment on, just generally, what does acoustic ecology need to be concerned with now? And what do you think are the major problems that it can be addressing? You've given us some specifics in your talk, but I wonder if you just have some things to say to each other about that. Go ahead and just unmute and talk.
That was a tough
then.
But
Oh no, you go.
Maybe I can start because I think when planning this project that this kind of urgent and interesting problem, and I became to think that this is the people's relationship to their environments was changing, and I wanted to sort of ask whether this was true and whether, for instance, the appearance of a lot of technology like smartphones, what kind of effect does it have to so I would think that different generations, do they have a different environmental relationship because of the ways they relate to technology and different materialities in their environments? And actually we tried to study that. And I was thinking that we were able to provide some answers. And if somebody is interested, you can find the book Sensory Transformations, and there are some thoughts on that. But what was interesting, that the kind of horror about that, just like John is saying that, oh no, people are not listening anymore. It appeared not to be true, not even when we met a lot of youngsters and children and young people. And actually they were very creatively using their mobile technologies in relation to the environment. So also, but also many of them said that they are actually shutting down their smartphones when they are going to forest, for example. In Finland, we have a lot of nature even inside towns and parks and small forests, and they said no, we want to listen to the birds. But I want to listen to the birds when I'm in the forest. But on the other hand, there are some other solutions, and I'm sure, John, for instance, you have been talking about how youngsters, or actually people in general, have one ear, the earphone in the one ear, and the other ear is listening. That was one solution, etc. But I would say that acoustic ecology has a lot to give in these discussions, and I would say that I was trying to show how soundscape thinking, it kind of gave seeds. It was not only Marie Schafer, but Hildegard Westerkamp, Barry Truax. It was a group of very creative people who gave the seeds, and we can now see the seeds and take them to different directions. And we can also very much argue against them, like John Sunji. There are some really old-fashioned provocations there that I'm sure that after some time also our work can be viewed critically.
Well, if ideas are robust, then they're able to be critiqued. And give Murray his due. He was okay with that. He was happy to be critiqued. Yeah. Leah. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Helmi, I didn't finish your thought.
Yeah, I just said that this was my point of listening point to your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Leah, is it Leah or Leah? Pardon me.
Leah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, please go ahead.
I guess, your question around the relational approach, I mean, I feel like that's absolutely, critical to acoustic ecology at the moment. And I feel like a lot of, the research that, we're seeing emerge more and more in Australia around acoustic ecology, particularly that interdisciplinary research and a lot of the acoustic ecology research that's been led by First Nations practitioners as well, is very much focused on that relational approach. And I think, for me, a big thing that has sort of emerged in a lot of these interdisciplinary acoustic ecology projects is also, that sense of reciprocity, it's such a fundamental and essential part of this research if it's to truly have impact in communities, that kind of, listening as a tool for reciprocity, but reciprocity kind of at the core of these research projects as well. I guess we've got such a spectrum of that very sort of Western colonial approach to environmental field recording, where it's going in, recording, taking from an environment, not asking for permission to record, all of those things, which I think a lot of these interdisciplinary acoustic ecology projects that are having impact and that can truly have impact in a community, are very much based on those models of reciprocity and, where listening can sort of have shared value in a community and how sound can really be that tool for knowledge sharing and connection. And I think, seeing the kind of dissonance in a lot of environmental research that's happening at the moment around, climate change and some of the ecological disasters that we're seeing, that kind of dissonance in Indigenous knowledge systems and scientific research and arts and cultural research. I see huge amounts of value where acoustic ecology and kind of listening as a method can be such a kind of fantastic bridge and way to kind of facilitate those interdisciplinary collaborations in a way that a lot of those dissonances and those kind of, the kind of, sorry, I'm losing my words a bit because it's midnight in Australia, but that, some of the challenges that we see in interdisciplinary research, I just see so much value for acoustic ecology as a way for us to, address many of the challenges that we have in the world today, particularly at that community level.
Thank you, Leah. John.
Well, I was just going to quickly add that the kind of important work that Leah and Helmi are talking about really needs to talk to the current kind of soundscape research going on within the world of engineering, which is huge, absolutely huge, and has millions of pounds of funding, and is developing very quickly and creating all kinds of international standards. But it's has a slight kind of engineering model to it. I mean, I'm kind of on the cusp of that world, but it lacks a lot of the nuance and subtleties that Schafer and Hildegard and Barry we're exploring, and that we are trying to deal with today as well. So it's very important that we talk with that soundscape research community as soon as possible.
Yeah, thank you for that. We've got some questions in the chat. So the first one is from Santiago Ranteria. How would you counter the normalization of machine listening technologies in acoustic ecology? The normalization of machine listening technologies. Leah, I think we're talking about the use of fine recording equipment. And this is interesting, this idea of machine listening. I'm not sure that this is what Santiago is getting at, but a researcher here at Carleton was telling me about a microphone array that he was very proud of having helped develop, whose purpose was to listen to the coughing of people in airports during the pandemic and identify whether those were COVID coughs, right? So that you get listening both as a form of surveillance and listening as a form of capturing or taking, and listening as a form of engaging. So what about this question?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think, it can go both ways, really, depending on the context. I mean, obviously there's kind of no escaping AI and machine listening now. I mean, it's exploding in the bioacoustics and ecoacoustics community. And I think in a lot of, research projects, if it's done ethically and is still kind of grounded in those sort of fundamental research questions, it can have a really sort of positive impact. I mean, there's a plethora of projects happening, here at the university that I'm based on, real-time algorithms for recognizing particular species of bats in the environment. So they're all machine listening tools. And I mean, that's been happening, very actively in that ultrasonic space for kind of well over a decade with some of those researchers. I mean, in some of my own research, we're developing recognizers for, recognizing particular species of fish in river systems. So those machine listening tools can monitor the presence and absence of the calls of particular fish. And I guess, we're still not at that point where a machine listening algorithm is going to have the same, capacity as a human brain in terms of, recognizing the nuances of that sound. But at the same time, we have these machine listening tools that can recognize vast amounts of ecological data over, years and years, that it would take, me the rest of my life to even listen to just the sounds we've recorded through the Biosphere Soundscapes project. So I feel like, it's not a question that I can kind of answer in a sort of yes or no way, because I think it really just depends on the project and the context and the ethics of that. But I think there's just so much of it happening at the moment, and I feel like there's going to be so much more happening in terms of, the potential of machine listening in ecoacoustics and bioacoustics work, that, it's really about doing it ethically. And I think one of the key things that I notice more and more working with science students coming into this, marine biology students and environmental science students, is just the importance of, you know, recognizing the value of listening when we've got a young, you know, animal ecology student who's taking a, you know, a bioacoustic recorder out into the field, placing it somewhere, going back to the lab, analyzing all the data. And with these machine listening tools, they can potentially go through that whole process without actually listening, when, you know, our ability to listen can inform every step of that process, from where we're placing the microphone in the field to how we're placing it to what sort of environmental questions we're asking of that data, and how we're analyzing the data from a more scientific perspective, of course. So I think, you know, the most critical thing in the development of these recognizers and, you know, machine listening tools is to ensure, you know, the practice of listening is still at the heart of them, and, you know, considering the ethics as well.
Thank you. John or Helmi, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, maybe I could say a couple of words. It just came to my mind that 26 years ago, I was visiting Tallinn Conservatory in Estonia, just after it had come out of socialism. And I was enthusiastically talking about the empowering power of listening. And there were some people who just dryly said that, well, here the listening has also some other meanings. And because they had been living in a society where they had been constantly surveys, been followed through listening. Even the walls of hotels were full of microphones. And so I just was like, wow, of course. And I don't know if the word panopticon has been used, but definitely there is this panopticon feeling nowadays, more and more. And I'm sure that it's, as you said, it's really alarming if they are already recording our coughing at the airport. But in a way, I also think that this recent, in Europe, European Council just renovated its ethical, you know, data legislation, privacy legislation. And after that, it's very difficult for us anthropologically inclined researchers to use sound. For instance, when we were doing our Sensotra public pages, which I was showing to you, the Sensotra tour, we could not use people's voices at all. We had to use voice actors talking, because that legislation is very strict, and because your voice is a personal identifier. We just, as researchers, we are not allowed to use it anymore, and it's a bit, makes things pretty difficult. And I'm not sure if that's all that is necessary, but we agreed. We used voice actors and it worked, but it's a little crazy sometimes.
Wow, no, that's fascinating. John, anything to add, or I'll move on to another question if not?
Well, I'm just reminded of the immigration services in the UK analysing people's accents to work out which village they come from, and that can make a difference between someone getting their access to the country or the, you know, getting an asylum status or not, which is terrifying because I don't know how robust that system is. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. You're giving us lots to think about, rethinking listening here. We have a question from David Rothenberg. He says, I'm curious how Murray Schafer would feel in today's world, where we have been taught to be very careful about not offending people who have different abilities and talents and points of view, because he sure was cranky. He loved offending people. Would he change his tone if he were writing and speaking today? I know what I think about that, but I'm fascinated to hear what some of you think about that. No one's going to touch this with a 10-foot pole.
Well, I remember, but I think he's. No, I remember being at a town hall event in near Peterborough,
In Peterborough, yes.
And there was a battle with the local speedway or something. Is that right? Am I getting the details correct? And Schafer did a talk. This was in the town hall, and Schafer did a talk there, and then trying to ban this thing. And then it was someone in the audience stood up and said, "Schafer, you're a fascist." And then they had this big fight, and it was great. It was like a proper local town hall debate about a local kind of noise issue, and it was pretty cranky, but it was like, it's quite nice, that real world context, to see how we function. You probably know more about it than me.
There was actually an amazing moment in that public forum where somebody in the front row was very, very upset with him and got up and railed at him and ran out of the room, and leaving us all just kind of jaw dropped. And Hildy Westerkamp said, "I think the fluorescent lights are causing us quite a lot of anxiety. So perhaps someone could turn them off." And someone did, and the tension in the room just resolved. So,
well, maybe I can just share a memory from that very event as well, because I found it was really interesting, and there was this heavy discussion, and Schafer was accused, and I think some of the remarks were apt about racism, even sexism, and also there was this that his book on noise is crap and it doesn't attend to that, and he just quite calmly said that, "Why don't you write your own book?" I think
yes, Emily Doolittle has a comment. She knew Schafer well. She suggests that she's going to guess he would not change his tone, but she also says, "I do think he liked individual people. He would probably try to make connections while talking with them individually. But it's hard to imagine him reining in his opinions in his writing." And of course, he was writing at a time when, certain people had license to just state their ideas as if they were verified fact. And we no longer approach academic writing in that way. We have a question from JT. "Amazing set of presentations. Thank you. I had a question for John. Just picking up on the last point about thinking through difference rather than disability in listening. Is there any worry that difference as a general term in some ways subsumes the major advocacy efforts on the part of the small d/large d deaf community in the last half century? This could also be thought of with respect to Jonathan Stern's impairment theory. Put another way, does making a bridge between so-called normative listening and non-normative listening by recasting disability as difference threaten the autonomy and agency of certain people who rely on those identities? It's not meant to be overcritical, just an honest question that I also wrestle with. If I could ask in person, I would imbue this question with smiles and good vibes," which is what I'm trying to convey to you now, John. Please go ahead.
I don't remember. I kind of, yeah, I know, yes, because I know people need a disability status to get funding to survive, for example. Yeah, and I'm certainly not questioning that whatsoever. It's just trying to find a more nuanced way to talk about hearing. And I think it has been quite, I know in the classroom, someone mentioned it, I find it in the classroom, talking in this way has been very, very helpful for people to just talk about their hearing. Because we all, especially composers, are the worst. And it's become a taboo subject to talk about one's own hearing, especially if you have an impairment. I've got tinnitus and hearing loss in one ear. And that potentially, if I started telling that too widely, I might destroy my amazing career as a film composer or whatever. But I get your point, and I think it's in fact, we had Jonathan Stern talking to us just the other day, and I actually could have asked him what he thought about this, our way of talking about oral diversity, and he didn't critique it. Not that he's got the last say and everything, but yeah, I get the point.
Yeah. I'm doing some work with deaf musicians who do something called signed music, which has no truck with sound at all. It's entirely kinetic and visual. And so I take your point. Our speaker JT was Jonathan Tyrrell, who I take your point that people have sometimes stake out particular positions because they have an important identity to express or thing to say. And I also, looping back to the question of Schafer's, thorny personality, Doug Friesen, who also worked closely with Schafer, says, I'm not sure I would say he would change his speaking or writing, but I think in his younger years anyway, his teaching practice, sound and listening practices was quite open and curious. And you see that in things like the wonderful National Film Board film Bing Bang Boom in the early 60s, where he's working with grade 7 students who then create their own composition. So we'll revisit the educational aspect of Schafer's work this afternoon. Navigating this, I've been kind of going back and forth. There's some other comments in the chat, which people can read. And lots of people, recounting experiences of sound being quite difficult and having to escape that sound. But I wonder, we do have 10 more minutes for this conversation. I wonder if anybody wants to put up their hand and make a comment, add to the discussion. Again, you can use the reaction button, and that will move you into my field of view, so I'll know that you're wanting to speak. And of course, if you have other questions you want to put in the chat. While we're waiting for that, I'll maybe ask the three of you another question. Do you think, we've been talking about the limits of sound and listening in some ways here. Do you think we need to take a more intersensory approach to the study of sound and listening? Helmi, your sensobiographic walking is exactly that. It expands beyond merely listening. Do we need to understand sound and listening in a more holistic context in terms of the senses? Maybe Helmi, we could ask you to speak first.
Yeah, actually, that was something I left out pretty much because there was so little time. But actually, yeah, when doing this kind of field work I just very particularly remember a moment in Lesconil, a fishing village in Brittany, where I was trying to organize these sonic memory walks, and we went around the fishing village and the really, really fascinating stories about the sounds in 1950s. But it was obvious that they just couldn't keep separate the smells, sounds, everything, the whole atmosphere. It just came out like booming, and it just was a kind of revelation that why do I even try to just separate the sound from all this flow of remarkable sensory remembering? So I just thought that, yeah, from now on, I will never ask only how do you, when you were walking here, what kind of sounds did you hear? Just sounds, smells, the whole atmosphere. And it appeared to be very, very good approach. And I think Jean-Paul Thibault from Cresson has written about this a lot, that we really need to move towards multisensory research, and the concept of atmosphere is very handy there. But I sort of think that, of course, we need also this particular approach to sound, but it is about time to also move ahead to these more multisensory approaches. That's my opinion.
Thank you. Leah or John, any comment to make?
Yeah, look, I'd agree. I think there's some really exciting possibilities in that multisensory practice, and I think for a long time a lot of the research I've been focused around with biosphere soundscapes and river listening, and that has been prioritizing sound and blindfolded sound walks and acousmatic listening experiences. But some of the more recent collaborative and interdisciplinary work has been sort of very much driven by like the value of having that that immersive audio visual engagement as well, and the work that I mentioned that Lyndon Davis has really been driving his own research around these ideas of cymatics, and he's really been passionate about the relationship between the visualization of a call of a particular totem species on Gubbi Gubbi country, and that relationship to traditional gubby patterns and designs. So, through these experiments with acoustic ecology and with somatic visualization and kind of these digital somatic techniques that we've been experimenting with, these ideas that he had around the correlation of the structure of the call of a particular, species. So black cockatoo, this example was, did correlate with these gubby patterns and designs. So, I'd kind of, I guess, pushed back on visualization of sound and that kind of visual engagement for many years. And now I think there's so many sort of exciting possibilities for that multisensory engagement, especially when, that those kind of connections can really arise. And all of those projects are still fundamentally about listening. They're just kind of enhanced by these, connections between other senses as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was thinking also what partly inspired me to reach out to you, and your work is so great. I just hadn't initially thought that I would rope someone from Australia into this day because of the time differences. But then I heard on the CBC about your project with Aboriginal women in prison, and the idea that you could bring home into the alienating space of the prison through sound, through soundscapes of home, and that the women themselves would have agency in helping to define and create those soundscapes. That was very inspiring. Yeah, John.
Yes, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's been we've maybe had a kind of reprioritization of hearing and sound over the last 10 or 20 years. And when I started my PhD, there was like 3 books or something. It was weird. But now there's endless time. I keep having to buy a new book every day or something. I mean, it's extraordinary. The research is exploring. But interesting enough, I mean, in my research, particularly around hyperacusis, because around the hand dryer stuff has some media presence, and then the public tried to find me as if thinking I could help them. And these are people of very, very sensitive hearing where everyday world is intolerable. And these are people where hearing is just like, is massive. It just controls everything, and they can barely cope. And it's like and here's me as this kind of acoustic ecology thinking, oh, isn't the sound wonderful? Listen to the nuance of and then suddenly I met with these people who are like, everything's too loud and painful. It's so it's important. Anyway, important to think about those people where they can't. It's so dominant on their life. They can't think about anything else. They can't. It just takes over everything.
That loops nicely to Hector's comment in the chat. He says, just thinking through Jonathan Turrell's point, friends from a social policy background would view a person's status as disabled as referring to the ways in which they, as merely different or diverse, are discriminated against by society rather than referring to something within that person. So definitely interesting to think about oral diversity, not as a disability, but as an instance of discrimination. And partly what you're talking about is the very, very different ways that we encounter the world through hearing, not all of which are by any means positive.
Yeah, and it should just to add, because there's a bit of discussion happening now about diversity, because it's also about children. I mean, because so we have this model called, I shouldn't talk about this too much, but there's this thing called autologically normal, which is based on the equal loudness contours, which many people talk about, and that is and that's where you get A-weighted decibels, which acoustics is kind of it's full of, it's everywhere, and for example, what about children? Children have smaller eustachian tubes. Smaller drum. Anyway, it's just a different device, different resonating channels. I mean, they're going to resonate at different frequencies. They're smaller. What's the word I'm trying to? What's that tube called? The auditory canal. Thank you. Not the eustachians, the one inside, but it's a smaller shape. A tiny kid's got a tiny tube there. It's going to resonate at much higher frequencies. It's not the same hearing. But we wouldn't say a child's hearing is disabled or impaired, but it's different from the autologically normal model, which is completely ubiquitous.
Yeah. When my kids were small, we noticed that our local grocery store, they couldn't bear to be in the lobby of the grocery store. And it turned out that they were emitting one of those mosquito signals that only young hearers can hear. And it's terrifically painful. So they were doing it to keep teenagers from loitering around the grocery store. But in fact, they were assaulting the ears of anybody who was young enough to do it. So there's this weaponization of sound comes out when we don't take aural diversity into account, or when we do and weaponize it, right?
And the knowledge of that is very, very minimal. The knowledge of highest frequency sound, very, very limited. And now these devices are everywhere to be rodent and bird deterrents. They're everywhere, 24/7, and there's no acoustic control over these because they're not known to have any damage in hearing because there's no science on it.
Right. It's time for us to say thank you to Helmi and Leah and John. And Helmi, I know you have to leave us. Thank you so much for your wisdom today. To all of you for wonderful presentations.